Someone in the lead wig-wagged his lantern. It was answered by the light in the rear, and the next minute the old rear song, "Lippy-la-go, go along, little doggy, you'll make a beef steer by and by," reached us riders in the swing, and we knew the rear guard of cattle was being pushed forward. The distance between the swing men gradually narrowed in our lead, from which we could tell the leaders were being held in, until several times cattle grazed out from the herd, due to the checking in front. At this juncture Flood galloped around the herd a second time, and as he passed us riding along our side, I appealed to him to let them go in front, as it now required constant riding to keep the cattle from leaving the trail to graze. When he passed up the other side, I could distinctly hear the men on that flank making a similar appeal, and shortly afterwards the herd loosened out, and we struck our old gait for several hours. Trailing by moonlight was a novelty to all of us, and in the stillness of those splendid July nights we could hear the pointmen chattering across the lead in front, while well in the rear the rattling of our heavily loaded wagon and the whistling of the horse wrangler to his charges reached our ears. The swingmen were scattered so far apart there was no chance for conversation amongst us, but every once in a while a song would be started, and as it surged up and down the line, every voice, good, bad, and indifferent, joined in. Singing is supposed to have a soothing effect on cattle, though I will vouch for the fact that none of our circled dots stopped that night to listen to our vocal efforts. The herd was traveling so nicely that our foreman hardly noticed the passing hours. But along about midnight the singing ceased, and we were nodding in our saddles and wondering if they in the lead were never going to throw off the trail, when a great wig-wagging occurred in front, and presently we overtook the rebel, holding the lantern and turning the herd out of the trail. It was then after midnight, and within another half hour we had the cattle bedded down within a few hundred yards of the trail. 1 hour guards was the order of the night, and as soon as our wagon and saddle horses came up, we stretched ropes and caught out our night horses. These we either tied to the wagon wheels or picketed near at hand, and then we sought our blankets for a few hours' sleep. It was 3:30 in the morning when our guard was called, and before the hour passed the first signs of day were visible in the east. But even before our watch had ended, Flood and the last guard came to our relief, and we pushed the sleeping cattle off the bed ground and started them grazing forward. Cattle will not graze freely in a heavy dew or too early in the morning, and before the sun was high enough to dry the grass, we had put several miles behind us. When the sun was about an hour high, the remainder of the outfit overtook us, and shortly afterward the wagon and saddle horses passed on up the trail, from which it was evident that breakfast would be served in the dining car ahead, as the traveled priest aptly put it. After the sun was well up, the cattle grazed freely for several hours, but when we sighted the remuda and our commissary some 2 miles in our lead, Flood ordered the herd lined up for a count. The rebel was always a reliable counter, and he and the foreman now rode forward and selected the crossing of a dry wash for the counting. On receiving their signal to come on, we allowed the herd to graze slowly forward, but gradually pointing them into an immense V, and as the point of the herd crossed the dry arroyo, we compelled them to pass in a narrow file between the two counters, when they again spread out fan-like and continued their feeding. The count confirmed the success of our driving by night, and on its completion all but 2 men rode to the wagon for breakfast. By the time the morning meal was disposed of, the herd had come up parallel with the wagon, but a mile to the westward, and as fast as fresh mounts could be saddled, we rode away in small squads to relieve the herders and to turn the cattle into the trail. It was but a little after 8 o'clock in the morning when the herd was again trailing out on the Powder River Trail, and we had already put 30 miles of the dry drive behind us, while so far neither horse nor cattle had been put to any extra exertion. The wagon followed as usual, and for over 3 hours we held the trail without a break, when, sighting a divide in our front, the foreman went back and sent the wagon around the herd with instructions to make the noon camp well up on the divide. We threw the herd off the trail within a mile of this stopping place and allowed them to graze, while 2/3 of our outfit galloped away to the wagon. We allowed the cattle to lie down and rest to their complete satisfaction until the middle of the afternoon. Meanwhile, all hands, with the exception of 2 men on herd, also lay down and slept in the shade of the wagon. When the cattle had had several hours' sleep, the want of water made them restless, and they began to rise and graze away. Then all hands were aroused, and we threw them upon the trail. The heat of the day was already over, and until the twilight of the evening we trailed a 3-mile clip, and again threw the herd off to graze. By our traveling and grazing gaits, we could form an approximate idea as to the distance we had covered, and the consensus of opinion of all was that we had already killed over half the distance. The herd was beginning to show the want of water by evening, but amongst our saddle horses the lack of water was more noticeable, as a horse subsisting on grass alone weakens easily, and riding them made them all the more gaunt. When we caught up our mounts that evening, we had used 8 horses to the man since we had left the South Fork, and another one would be required at midnight or whenever we halted. We made our drive the second night with more confidence than the one before, but there were times when the train of cattle must have been nearly 2 miles in length. Yet there was never a halt as long as the man with the lead light could see the one in the rear. We bedded the herd about midnight, and at first break of day the 4th guard with the foreman joined our watch, and we started the cattle again. There was a light dew the second night, and the cattle, hungered by their night walk, went to grazing at once on the damp grass, which would allay their thirst slightly. We allowed them to scatter over several thousand acres, for we were anxious to graze them well before the sun absorbed the moisture, but at the same time every step they took was one less to the coveted Powder River. When we had grazed the herd forward several miles, and the sun was nearly an hour high, the wagon failed to come up, which caused our foreman some slight uneasiness. Nearly another hour passed, and still the wagon did not come up, nor did the outfit put in an appearance. Soon afterwards, however, Moss Strayhorn overtook us and reported that over 40 of our saddle horses were missing, while the work mules had been overtaken nearly 5 miles back on the trail. On account of my ability as a trailer, Flood at once dispatched me to assist Honeyman in recovering the missing horses, instructing someone else to take the remuda and the wagon and horses to follow up the herd. By the time I arrived, most of the boys at camp had secured a change of horses, and I caught up my grulla that I was saving for the last hard ride, for the horse hunt which confronted us. McCann, having no fire built, gave Honeyman and myself an impromptu breakfast and 2 canteens of water. But before we let the wagon get away, we rustled a couple cans of tomatoes and buried them in a cache near the campground, where we would have no trouble in finding them on our return. As the wagon pulled out, we mounted our horses and rode back down the trail. Billy Honeyman understood horses, and at once volunteered the belief that we would have a long ride overtaking the missing saddle stock. The absent horses, he said, were principally the ones which had been under saddle the day before, and as we both knew, a tired, thirsty horse will go miles for water. He recalled also that while we were asleep at noon the day before, 20 miles back on the trail, the horses had found quite a patch of wild sorrel plant, and were foolish over leaving it. Both of us being satisfied that this would hold them for several hours at least, we struck a free gait for it. After we passed the point where the mules had been overtaken, the trail of the horses was distinct enough for us to follow in an easy canter. We saw frequent signs that they left the trail, no doubt to graze, but only for short distances, when they would enter it again and keep it for miles.